I'm Clara, 31 female. I'm an architect living with my wonderful fiancé, Liam, in a small apartment that we've lovingly called home for the past 4 years. For most of my adult life, I've poured every ounce of my energy into two things: my career and the dream of designing and building my own house from the ground up. This house wasn't just a project. It was the culmination of everything I'd worked for, a symbol of the future Liam and I were building together. But I never imagined that the very family who was supposed to cheer me on would see my dream not as a home, but as a handout. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The scent of sawdust and fresh paint has been my favorite perfume for the past 18 months. For a decade, I'd sketched my dream house on napkins, in the margins of notebooks, and in complex digital models. It was a modest but beautiful 2-story home with a wide porch, an open-concept living area, and a studio for me that bathed in the morning light. Every beam, every window, and every floorboard was a decision Liam and I had made together. He handled the spreadsheets and the budget with the precision of the financial analyst he was, while I obsessed over load-bearing walls and the perfect shade of slate gray for the roof. We didn't take out a massive loan, we saved. We sacrificed vacations, drove a 10-year-old car, and ate more home-cooked meals than I can count. This house was built not just with wood and nails, but with our discipline and shared commitment. My family, however, viewed my success through a different lens. My mother, Diane, a retired teacher, always believed in a communal approach to family resources, which in practice meant that my resources were for the community. My younger sister, Isla, had floated through life on a cloud of charm and vague aspirations. While I was pulling all-nighters in architecture school, she was finding herself. While I was working my way up from intern to project lead, she was launching a series of short-lived careers, currently settling on being a freelance social media manager, which seemed to involve more brunch photos than actual management. The comments started subtly. When I first showed my mom the blueprints, her first reaction wasn't praise. It was a thoughtful hum followed by, "That's a lot of space for just 2 people, isn't it?" I'd laughed it off, explaining our plans for a future family for guest rooms for our life. But the seed was planted. A few weeks later, Isla called me, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Clara, I was just thinking," she began, a phrase that always preceded a request. "That little room next to the master bedroom, it would be the most perfect nursery. The light is just gorgeous." "That's my office, Isla," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You know, where I plan to work from home." "Oh, right, of course. Silly me," she giggled. "It's just so easy to imagine a little one in there." At the time, Isla wasn't even in a serious relationship, so the comment was bizarre, but it was part of a pattern. Every conversation about the house was slowly reframed. It was Clara and Liam's house anymore. In my mother's conversations with relatives, it became the new family house. She'd talk about hosting holidays there as if she were the owner, planning where the Christmas tree would go and which room would be for which cousin. Liam noticed it too. He'd squeeze my hand under the table at family dinners when my mom would casually mention how the large backyard would be perfect for Isla's future kids to run around in. He saw the frustration in my eyes, the slow, simmering resentment that I was trying desperately to contain for the sake of peace. My mistake was believing their behavior stemmed from a place of misguided love and excitement. I thought they were just getting carried away. I didn't realize it was a calculated campaign. The pressure intensified as the house neared completion. Isla suddenly started having financial troubles. Her freelance work was in a slump, and she began making comments about how stressful her tiny apartment was and how she didn't know how she'd ever afford a place of her own. My mother would then swoop in with the solution. "Clara, you have so much room," she'd say over the phone. "Maybe Isla could stay with you for just a few months when the house is done, just to get back on her feet." Each time, I politely but firmly shut it down. "Mom, Liam and I are just settling in. It's our first home. We want to enjoy it by ourselves for a while." This response was always met with a sigh of disappointment, a guilt-laden, I just thought you'd want to help your sister. Family is supposed to help family. The house was finished in early spring, a week before our engagement party. Liam and I had decided to host the party at the new house. It felt symbolic, a celebration of our future together in the very space we had built for it. We wanted our closest friends and family to see the fruits of our labor, to share in our joy. My friend and colleague, Maya, who had helped me with some of the interior design choices, was ecstatic. "You did it, Clara," she'd said, touring the finished space. "You built your dream. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for it." Her words echoed in my mind as I sent out the invitations. I invited my mother and Isla over for a private tour before the party. I hoped that seeing it, really seeing how much of myself was in that house, would make them understand. I was wrong. As I walked them through, Isla didn't see a home. She saw an inventory. "Wow, this kitchen is huge. I could do so many cooking videos in here," she mused, running her hands over the quartz countertops I'd saved for a year to afford. My mom, meanwhile, was measuring the downstairs guest room with her eyes. "You know, if you took out that desk, you could easily fit a crib and a changing table in here," she announced. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a statement. That evening, after they left, I felt a knot of dread in my stomach. Liam found me in my new studio, staring out the large window at the darkening sky. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. "They're getting worse, aren't they?" he said softly. I nodded, leaning back into his embrace. "It's like they've already moved her in. They're planning her life in our house, Liam, and I feel like I'm going crazy." "You're not crazy," he said firmly. "You've set a boundary, and they're refusing to respect it. We just need to be a united front at the party on Saturday. We'll be polite, but we'll be firm." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that a simple, firm no would be enough. But as I thought about the sweet, vacant smile on my sister's face and the unwavering certainty in my mother's eyes, I knew it wouldn't be. They weren't asking anymore. They were expecting. They believed they were entitled to my dream, and our engagement party was going to be their stage to make that entitlement public. The dread didn't go away. It felt like a crack in the foundation of the beautiful life I was trying to build, a crack they were determined to split wide open. I didn't know then just how deep that crack already was, or the rot that had been festering beneath the surface for months. The party was meant to be a celebration of new beginnings, but I had a chilling premonition that it was going to be an ending. The day of the engagement party was bright and crisp, a perfect autumn afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of our new living room, glinting off champagne flutes and illuminating the hopeful faces of our friends. The house was filled with laughter, music, and the warm buzz of celebration. For the first few hours, I allowed myself to relax. Liam was a rock by my side, his hand either on my back or holding mine, a silent source of strength. Our friends complimented every detail of the house, from the reclaimed wood mantelpiece to the custom bookshelves I had designed. They saw our home for what it was, a reflection of us. My mother and sister, however, moved through the rooms with an air of ownership. I watched Isla point out the guest bathroom to a cousin, saying, "I'm thinking of redeling this in a nice sea green." My mom held court in the kitchen, telling our relatives how she had advised me on the layout for maximum family efficiency. I tried to ignore it, focusing on Liam and the joy of the occasion. But every entitled comment was a small splinter under my skin. Around 5 o'clock, as the afternoon sun began to dip, my mother clinked a spoon against her glass. The cheerful chatter subsided, and all eyes turned to her. She stood in the center of the room, beaming, a proud matriarch presiding over her domain. "If I could have everyone's attention, please," she began, her voice resonating with practiced authority. "I just want to say a few words about my wonderful daughters and this beautiful new home." I felt Liam's hand tighten around mine. This was it. "I am so proud of Clara," she continued, smiling directly at me. "She has worked so hard to build this incredible house. It's a testament to her talent and dedication. A house this big, this lovely, it's really meant to be filled with family, with love, with the laughter of children." She paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air. My relatives nodded in agreement, their faces soft with sentiment. "And speaking of family," my mother said, her smile widening as she turned to my sister, who stood beside her looking demure and hopeful. Many of you know that our dear Isla is hoping to start a family of her own soon. She's found a wonderful partner, and they are so excited to begin their journey into parenthood. This was news to me. Isla had been dating someone for a few months, but this was the first I'd heard of it being serious, let alone them planning for a baby. A murmur of excitement went through the crowd of relatives. Isla blushed and looked at the floor, a perfect picture of shy, maternal aspiration. But as you know, my mother went on, her tone shifting to one of mild concern, starting out is difficult. Finding a stable, safe place to raise a child is the biggest hurdle, which is why it's such a blessing that Clara has built this amazing home with so much extra space. She raised her glass higher, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on me again. Her expression was no longer warm, it was expectant, bordering on demanding. So, I'd like to propose a toast, not just to Clara and Liam and their engagement, but to family helping family. I want to announce that we've all decided it's for the best that Isla and her future family will be moving in here with Clara and Liam. The words exploded into the quiet room. You should let your sister move into your new house since she'll be starting a family soon. It's the right thing to do, to family. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then, my relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins who had been conditioned for years by my mother's narrative of communal family, burst into applause. They were smiling, nodding, raising their glasses. They saw this not as an outrageous demand, but as a beautiful, selfless gesture on my part. I looked at Liam. His face was a mask of disbelief, his jaw tight with anger. My friend Maya looked like she'd been slapped, her mouth hanging open. And then I looked at my sister. Isla was no longer looking at the floor. She was looking right at me, a sweet, triumphant smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a hopeful smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won. In that moment, everything crystallized. This wasn't a spontaneous, misguided announcement from my mother. This was a planned ambush. They had orchestrated this entire scene, using the public setting of my engagement party to corner me, to leverage the pressure of family opinion to force my hand. They expected me to be embarrassed, to be flustered, and to ultimately cave under the weight of everyone's applause. They thought they had backed me into a corner, where saying no would make me look like a selfish, ungrateful monster. A cold, calm clarity washed over me, extinguishing the hot flare of anger. The dread I'd been feeling for weeks was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my desire for peace for weakness. They thought they were playing checkers, but I had been preparing for a chess match. While my relatives were still clapping and my mother was looking at me with a smug, non-negotiable expression, I let go of Liam's hand. I gave him a small, reassuring look that said, "I've got this." I smiled serenely at my mother. "Thank you, Mom," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the applause. "That's an incredibly generous offer you've made on my behalf." The clapping faltered. The room grew quiet again, sensing the shift in tone. "You're right," I continued, my smile never wavering. "This house was built for family, and you're also right that it's important for family to have a stable, secure place to live, especially when they're starting out." My mother's smug expression intensified. She thought I was agreeing. Isla's smile widened. "It's funny you should bring this up tonight, actually," I said, turning slightly to pick up my handbag from a nearby chair, "because I have a little announcement of my own." I reached into my bag and my fingers closed around the crisp edges of a folded document. I pulled it out slowly. It was a single sheet of paper, a legal document. "It seems you and Isla have been doing a lot of planning for my house, but you forgot to include me in the conversation. Luckily, I've been having some conversations of my own." I unfolded the paper. The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. My relatives looked confused. My mother's smile had vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Isla's sweet expression was frozen on her face. Liam stood beside me, his shock now replaced with dawning comprehension and pride. I held up the document for everyone to see. "This," I announced, my voice ringing with unshakable finality, "is a rental agreement." I paused, letting the words sink in. Then, I lowered the paper and looked directly at my sister. "And this is a credit report." My eyes then shifted to my mother, whose face was rapidly draining of color. "And I'm about to read something that I think will clarify everyone's living arrangements from now on." The silence in the room was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The cheerful party atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a tense, palpable curiosity. My relatives stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and intrigue. My mother's confident smirk had dissolved into a tight line of disbelief, while Isla's sweet smile was beginning to look strained, almost brittle. "A rental agreement?" my mother finally sputtered, her voice a harsh whisper. "Clara, what is the meaning of this? This is a party, not a business meeting." "It became a business meeting the moment you tried to publicly assign a tenant to my property, Mom," I replied calmly, my eyes not leaving hers. I then turned my attention to the document in my hand. "As I was saying, Liam and I have been thinking a lot about the future. And with a house this size, it's important to have everything in order, legally speaking." I began to read from the top page, my voice steady and clear. "This document is a standard month-to-month lease agreement for the property located at 124 Willow Creek Lane. It outlines the terms of tenancy, including a monthly rent of $2,500, a security deposit of 1 month's rent, and a clause stipulating that any long-term guests, defined as anyone staying more than 7 consecutive days, must be approved by the landlords and undergo a standard background and credit check." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. A rent of $2,500 was steep for our area, but it was the market rate for a space the size of the guest suite my mother had mentally assigned to Isla. It was a price I knew my sister couldn't possibly afford. Isla's face paled. "Clara, this is insane," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't be serious, we're family." "I am very serious," I said, meeting her gaze. "Family or not, this is my and Liam's home and our single largest financial asset. We can't just have people living here for free. That wouldn't be financially responsible." I used their own logic, the cold, practical language of necessity they had tried to use on me, and turned it back on them. I then lifted the second sheet of paper. "Which brings me to this," I announced. "As part of our due diligence, Liam ran a preliminary credit check on Isla." This wasn't entirely true. The story of how I got this information was far more complex, but this was the simplified version for the public execution. We just wanted to be sure she would be a reliable tenant should she ever formally apply. My mother took a step forward. "You ran a credit check on your own sister? How could you, Clara? That's a violation of her privacy." "Is it?" I countered, raising an eyebrow. "Is it more of a violation than you announcing her tenancy to a room full of people without my consent? I believe my actions were a prudent response to a situation that was forced upon me." I didn't wait for her to answer. I looked down at the paper. "The report is illuminating. It seems Isla has over $30,000 in credit card debt, a history of late payments on her car loan, and a credit score that, frankly, wouldn't qualify her to rent a storage unit, let alone a room in this house." A collective gasp went through my family. Isla looked as though I had physically struck her. All her life, she had curated an image of a carefree, artistic soul who was above such worldly concerns as debt and credit scores. I had just shattered that image in front of everyone she knew. This was the moment of discovery for them, but my own discovery had happened weeks earlier, not in a dramatic flourish, but in a quiet, gut-wrenching moment of realization. It began with a nagging suspicion, a feeling that my sister's sudden talk of starting a family was too convenient. It had all started about 2 months before the party. I had called Isla to ask for a recommendation for a landscaper, and she had been oddly secretive about who she was with. I heard a man's voice in the background, one I didn't recognize. When I asked, she'd been evasive. "Oh, it's just a friend," she'd said quickly before changing the subject. A week later, Liam and I were at a local home goods store picking out light fixtures. In the aisle next to us, I heard that same man's voice. He was on the phone, speaking in a low, frustrated tone. "Look, Isla, you have to give me more time," he was saying. "Your mother is putting all this pressure on me, talking about rings and nurseries. We've only been dating for 3 months." My blood ran cold. I peeked around the shelf. It was Isla's new boyfriend, a man named Mark. He looked stressed and overwhelmed. He continued, "She's going on and on about her other daughter's huge new house and how we can just live there for free. It's too much, too fast." I pulled Liam away before Mark could see us, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just my mother. It was a coordinated plan. They were pressuring this poor man, using my house as bait to lock him into a future with Isla. The starting a family narrative wasn't a dream, it was a strategy. This was the first whisper in the walls, the first sign that this was not just entitlement, but a full-blown conspiracy. That evening, I sat Liam down and told him what I'd overheard. The hurt in his eyes quickly turned to a protective anger. He agreed that something was very wrong. My journey down the rabbit hole had just begun, and the whispers were about to become a roar. I knew then that I couldn't just say no. I had to build a fortress, and that fortress had to be made of undeniable, cold, hard facts. The rental agreement and credit report were just the first bricks in that wall. Back at the party, the room was buzzing with hushed conversations. My relatives were no longer looking at me as the selfish daughter, but at my mother and sister with new, questioning eyes. The narrative had been flipped. I wasn't denying my needy sister a home. I was protecting my investment from a financially irresponsible person who had been caught in a lie. I folded the papers deliberately and placed them back in my bag. "So, as you can see," I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm, "it simply wouldn't be possible for Isla to live here under any circumstances. But we wish her the best of luck in finding a place she can afford." I then turned to the rest of our guests, a gracious hostess once more. "Now, please, everyone, enjoy the party. There's plenty more champagne, and the cake will be cut in about 30 minutes. It was a dismissal, a clear signal that the public portion of this confrontation was over. My mother and sister stood frozen in the middle of the room, exposed and humiliated. The applause they had expected had turned into whispers and pitying glances. They hadn't just been denied, they had been dismantled. The aftermath of my announcement at the party was a strange, suspended moment in time. Some guests, mostly our friends, tried to resume their conversations, but the energy in the room was irrevocably broken. My mother and sister stood there for a long moment, their faces a thunderous mixture of rage and shame, before my mother grabbed Isla's arm and stormed out the front door without another word. The dramatic exit was followed by a trickle of relatives, who offered awkward, hasty congratulations on the engagement before scurrying away, clearly uncomfortable with the family implosion they had just witnessed. Once the house was empty save for Liam, Maya, and me, I finally let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. Maya came over and wrapped me in a fierce hug. "That was the most terrifying and incredible thing I have ever seen," she whispered in my ear. "Are you okay?" "I am now," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. The weight of their expectations, the constant gaslighting and emotional manipulation, had been lifted. "Aaliyah." M came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "I am so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were brilliant." "We were brilliant," I corrected him, turning to kiss him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Later that night, as we sat with Maya in the quiet of our living room, I explained the full story of my investigation, the meticulous process of uncovering the blueprint of their lies. It had started with overhearing Isla's boyfriend, Mark, in the store. That incident had been the catalyst, transforming my vague unease into a focused mission for the truth. My first step was to learn more about Mark. I did something I wasn't proud of, but felt was necessary. I looked him up online. He was easy to find. His social media profile painted a picture of a perfectly normal guy, a high school history teacher, close with his family, loved hiking. There was nothing that suggested he was a willing participant in my family's scheme. In fact, his posts were all about taking things slow in life. It didn't add up. My next step was to talk to my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. She was the family gossip, but she had a soft spot for me and had always been more level-headed than my mom. I invited her for coffee under the guise of asking for wedding planning advice. I started by casually mentioning how happy I was for Isla and her new serious relationship. Aunt Carol frowned. "Serious? Honey, your mother is practically pushing that poor boy down the aisle. She met him once and started sending him links to baby cribs. He told your cousin David that he was feeling completely overwhelmed." Bingo, confirmation that the pressure was real and coming directly from my mother. "Mom's just excited, I guess," I said, feigning innocence. "It's more than excitement, Clara," Carol said, lowering her voice. "Your mother, she's always been jealous of your success. Not in a mean way, she's proud of you, but she also sees everything you have as something Isla is entitled to. She thinks you got the brains and the drive, so Isla should get the benefits. She calls it balancing the scales." The phrase balancing the scales sent a chill down my spine. My life's work wasn't an achievement to them. It was a resource to be plundered to make my sister's life easier. It was a twisted, toxic form of family fairness. Armed with this new understanding, I knew I needed concrete evidence of Isla's financial situation. The credit report I'd mentioned at the party wasn't obtained through Liam. I knew that would be illegal. The truth was far simpler, and it came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks before the party, I got a call from a credit card company. They were trying to reach Isla about a severely delinquent account, and they were calling me because I was listed as a reference on her original application from years ago. I told them I wasn't in regular contact, but the agent, likely trying to apply pressure, let it slip that the outstanding balance was over $15,000 on that one card alone. After that call, I did some more digging. I remembered Isla mentioning a creative financing method for her car a year ago. A quick, anonymous call to a friend who worked in auto finance confirmed that the type of high-interest loan she described was typically reserved for those with very poor credit. The pieces were falling into place. Isla wasn't just in a slump. She was in a deep financial hole, and my house was her escape ladder. The final piece of the puzzle came from Isla herself, though she didn't know it. She had an old laptop that she'd left at my apartment months ago after it had broken. She told me to just throw it away. I never did. On a hunch, I took it to a repair shop. The technician was able to recover the hard drive. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I found a folder labeled Vision Board. Inside were not just photos of my house, but screenshots of text conversations between her and my mother. The texts were damning. They laid out the entire plan in horrifying detail. "Mom, did you mention the nursery to her again? We need to keep planting the seed that the house is for the family." "Isla, I tried. She keeps talking about her stupid office. She's being so selfish." "Mom, don't worry, I'll handle it. The party is the perfect time. Once I announce it in front of everyone, she won't have a choice but to agree. She'd be too embarrassed to say no." Another conversation was about Mark. "Isla, Mark is getting cold feet. He said we're moving too fast." "Mom, just remind him that he won't have to worry about a mortgage or rent. He can save his entire teacher's salary. What man would say no to that? He just needs to be managed." Reading those messages felt like a betrayal on a cellular level. It wasn't just entitlement. It was a cold, calculated, malicious plot. They had strategized how to manipulate me, how to pressure Isla's boyfriend, and how to use public opinion as a weapon. Against me, they had discussed my selfishness while planning to steal my future. I showed everything to Liam. He read the texts, his face growing darker with every word. When he was done, he looked at me, his eyes blazing. "Okay," he said. "They want to play games? Let's play." That was when my sadness and hurt hardened into something else, a cold, methodical need for justice. The house they saw as a resource to be exploited was my creation. I was an architect. I knew how to build, but I also knew that sometimes The first step to building something strong is to demolish what's rotten. My mother and sister had laid a faulty foundation of lies and manipulation. It was time to tear it all down. With the full scope of their deception laid bare, Liam and I shifted from defense to offense. The 2 weeks leading up to the engagement party were not filled with cake tastings and seating charts, but with strategic planning sessions at our kitchen table. The pain of the betrayal was still raw, but it fueled a powerful clarity. We weren't just trying to say no anymore. We were preparing to deliver a consequence so definitive that they would never try to cross our boundaries again. We were drafting the blueprint for our counterattack. Our first decision was to let the party proceed. Canceling it would have been the easy way out, but it would have allowed them to control the narrative. They would have painted me as unstable and emotional, claiming I'd overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. No, the trap had been set for me, but I was going to be the one to spring it. The public stage they had chosen for my humiliation would become the theater for their downfall. Liam, with his analytical mind, broke down our objectives. Expose the lie. We needed to publicly dismantle their narrative of the needy sister and the family home. Establish a permanent boundary. We had to make it clear that my house was off limits, now and forever, in a way they couldn't argue with. Seize control. We had to take back the power they had tried to strip from me, demonstrating that I was not a passive victim to be manipulated. The idea for the rental agreement came from Liam. "They're treating this like a transaction," he'd said one evening, scrolling through legal document templates on his laptop. "They see your house as an asset they're owed, so let's treat them like what they are, prospective tenants. And tenants have to qualify." It was brilliant. It reframed the entire situation from an emotional family dispute into a simple, impersonal business matter. It took their weapon, the concept of family obligation, and rendered it useless against the shield of legal and financial prudence. We drafted the lease agreement together. We set the rent at a fair but undeniably high market rate. We included standard clauses about credit checks, guest policies, and grounds for eviction. Every word was chosen to be a brick in our wall. It was a document of defense, masquerading as a simple piece of paperwork. Next came the credit report. I told Liam about the phone call from the collection agency and my other discoveries. While I couldn't legally run a credit check on Isla, I could present the information I had gathered as if it were part of a formal report. I compiled the facts: the delinquent credit card, the high-interest car loan, her unstable income. I put it all onto a single sheet, formatted to look official. It was a prop, but a prop backed by solid truth. While Liam handled the paperwork, I focused on the emotional and logistical side of our plan. I called my Aunt Carol again. "Aunt Carol," I said, "I have a strange favor to ask. I need you to make sure Mom and Isla are standing in the middle of the room when Mom gives her toast at the party." She was quiet for a moment. "Clara, what are you planning?" "I'm planning on telling the truth," I said simply, "but I need them right where everyone can see them. I need them to have the spotlight they so desperately want." I didn't give her the details, but she understood my tone. She knew I wasn't just rolling over. "I'll see what I can do," she promised. I also confided fully in Maya. She was horrified by the text messages, but her shock quickly turned to righteous anger on my behalf. "Good," she said, her eyes flashing. "Don't let them get away with it. An architect protects the integrity of her structure. Your life is your structure, Clara. Protect it." She promised to run interference at the party, to manage any guests who became too overwhelmed, and to be our key witness and support system. The most difficult part of the plan was preparing myself for the confrontation. I spent hours rehearsing what I would say. I wrote it down, memorized it, and recited it in front of the mirror. I practiced keeping my voice steady, my hands from shaking. I had to deliver the lines without anger, without tears. It had to be cold, factual, and final. It had to be a demolition, not a meltdown. Liam coached me, reminding me to breathe, to stand tall, to look them directly in the eye. The day before the party, Liam found Mark's phone number through a mutual acquaintance. He called him. He introduced himself and said, "Mark, I'm not sure what Isla and her mother have been telling you, but I need to make something very clear. You are not under any circumstances, moving into our house. There has been a serious misunderstanding, and I suggest you have a very direct conversation with Isla about your future." We heard later that Mark broke up with Isla that very night, telling her he refused to be a pawn in her family's toxic games. This was an unforeseen but welcome consequence. The future family my mother was so eager to house had just been dissolved. On the morning of the party, as we arranged flowers and set out glasses, the house was quiet and calm. I placed my handbag on the chair where I would be sitting, the folded documents tucked securely inside. It felt like a hidden weapon. Liam came and stood beside me, looking around the sunlit room. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings filling my lungs. "They came into my house and tried to claim it," I said, my voice filled with a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. "They tried to rewrite my blueprint. Today, we're restoring the original design." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "The original design is perfect." Our plan was complete. The stage was set, the props were in place, and the actors knew their lines. We were no longer dreading the confrontation, we were ready for it. It was the final draft of our new life, a life where the doors would be open to those who respected us and firmly closed to those who sought to use us. The party was about to begin, and the performance of a lifetime was about to unfold. The moments after I finished speaking felt like a vacuum. The party guests, my relatives, were stunned into a collective silence, their minds scrambling to process the whiplash of emotions. They had gone from celebrating an engagement to celebrating a supposedly selfless family act to witnessing a brutal, clinical execution. My mother, Diane, was the first to recover. The color that had drained from her face came rushing back in a tide of crimson fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She took a step towards me, her finger pointing accusingly. "How dare you air our private family matters in front of all these people? How dare you humiliate your own sister like that?" "I didn't humiliate her, Mom," I replied, my voice still unnervingly calm. "Her own choices did. I just read the results. And as for private family matters, you're the one who chose this audience. You stood in the middle of my home and tried to give it away. You made it public. I'm just finishing the conversation you started." "This is not about money and credit scores." She shot back, her voice rising. "This is about family. This is about loyalty. Isla is your sister. She needed your help, and you prepared a lawsuit instead." "It's not a lawsuit, it's a rental agreement," Liam interjected, stepping forward slightly to stand by my side. His presence was a silent, unshakable wall. "And loyalty runs both ways, Diane. What you and Isla planned was not a request for help. It was a hostile takeover of my fiancé's property. It was deceitful." Isla, who had been standing frozen like a statue, finally cracked. "T." RS welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of hurt. They were tears of pure rage. "You've ruined everything," she shrieked at me, the sweet facade completely gone, revealing the ugly, grasping entitlement beneath. "I had a plan. We had a plan. Mark and I were going to get engaged. We were going to have a baby. We were going to be happy here." "You mean you were going to be happy here?" I corrected her. "Mark is no longer part of your plan. He broke up with you last night." The color drained from Isla's face again. This was clearly news to her. She looked from me to my mother in a panic. "What? No, he wouldn't." "He did," I said flatly. "Liam called him. We felt it was only fair to let him know that the free house you promised him was never on the table. Turns out he wasn't interested in being managed into a life he didn't want. He didn't appreciate being used as a prop in your scheme to get a free ride." That was the final blow for Isla. Her face crumpled, and a raw, guttural sob escaped her lips. This was the true source of her pain, not my cruelty, but the collapse of her meticulously constructed, fraudulent future. She had lost the house and the man in one fell swoop. My mother, seeing her favored daughter fall apart, turned her fury back on me, her eyes blazing with a lifetime of perceived injustices. "Look what you've done," she screamed. "You've always been like this, so selfish. You get everything you want, The career, the man, the house, and you can't stand to see your sister have a little piece of it. I raised you to be better than this." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. I couldn't help it. "You didn't raise me to be better, Mom. You raised me to be a resource for Isla. You call it balancing the scales. You think because my life has turned out well, I owe a piece of it to her, but you're wrong. My success is not a communal pie for you to slice up and distribute as you see fit. I earned this. I worked for this. Liam and I sacrificed for this. And what did you and Isla do? You schemed. You lied. You tried to manipulate and emotionally blackmail me." I finally pulled out my phone where I had saved screenshots of the text messages. "You want to talk about family matters in public? Let's talk about them." I held up the phone. "Here's a text from you, Mom, telling Isla to keep planting the seed that my house is for the family. And here's one where you conspire to ambush me at my own party because you knew I'd be too embarrassed to say no. Is that what a loving mother does?" A wave of shocked gasps went through the few remaining relatives who were huddled by the door, too fascinated by the train wreck to leave. My Aunt Carol stared at her sister, her expression one of deep disappointment. My mother was speechless. She looked at the phone, then back at my face, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. She had been exposed completely. There was no argument left, no emotional appeal she could make. The facts were laid bare, and they were ugly. "This is not your house," I said, my voice dropping to a low, definitive tone. "It is my and Liam's house. Isla will never live here. And frankly, after today, I'm not sure when either of you will ever be welcome here again." I looked from my sister's sobbing form to my mother's stunned face. "You wanted a piece of my house? Congratulations, you've just been permanently evicted from my life. Now, please get out." The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, my mother, with a final, withering glare of pure hatred, grabbed Isla's arm and practically dragged her out of the house. The front door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of the room. The demolition was complete. The rotten structure of lies, entitlement, and manipulation had been brought down. The air was clear. Standing in the rubble, I didn't feel triumphant or joyful. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the family I wished I had, but also a quiet, powerful sense of relief. The foundation was finally clean. Now, Liam and I could start building for real. The months that followed the party were a study in silence. There were no angry phone calls, no tearful apologies, no attempts at reconciliation from my mother or sister. It was as if, by exposing their scheme, I had ceased to exist for them. The silence was hurtful at first, a constant reminder of the chasm that had opened in our family. But as weeks turned into months, the silence began to feel less like an absence and more like peace. My Aunt Carol called me a week after the party. "I'm so sorry, Clara," she'd said, her voice heavy with regret. "I had no idea how bad it was. Your mother, she's telling everyone you're a monster, that you threw your poor, destitute sister out on the street. But the ones who were there, who saw the look on her face when you mentioned the texts, they know the truth." The family was divided, as I had expected. Some chose to believe my mother's distorted narrative, but many others reached out quietly, offering support. They had witnessed my mother's manipulative tactics for years, but had never dared to challenge her. My stand at the party had, in a way, given them permission to acknowledge the truth. Liam and I focused on our future. We got married 3 months later in a small, intimate ceremony on the back deck of our beautiful new home. We were surrounded only by our closest friends and the family members who had stood by us. Maya was my maid of honor, and Liam's brother was his best man. It was a perfect day, filled with genuine love and uncomplicated joy. There were no hidden agendas, no manipulative toasts, just the celebration of a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. We learned through the family grapevine what happened to Isla. Without the prospect of free housing, and with a soured reputation among those who knew the truth, her life took a downward turn. She couldn't afford her apartment and had to move back in with my mother. The shame of her public exposure and the failure of her grand plan reportedly sent her into a deep depression. She and my mother were now trapped together in a small house, their relationship soured by resentment and failed conspiracies. It was a prison of their own making. I felt a distant pang of pity for them, but it was overshadowed by the profound sense of peace in my own life. Living in the house was everything I had dreamed it would be. I set up my studio, and the morning light was just as perfect as I had designed. Liam and I planted a garden in the backyard. We hosted game nights with our friends, filling the rooms with the laughter and warmth I had always imagined. The house was no longer a point of contention, it was a sanctuary. It was our home, untainted by the grasping hands of entitlement. About a year after the wedding, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my mother. It was a short, stilted letter, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of sorts. She wrote that she had been thinking a lot about what happened and that she realized she had made mistakes driven by her fierce love for her children. She said she missed me and hoped that one day we could talk. I read the letter several times, trying to find a genuine note of remorse in her words. But even in her supposed apology, she was centering her own feelings, her own fierce love, rather than the hurt she had caused. There was no mention of the lies, the manipulation, or the conspiracy. I discussed it with Liam. "What do you want to do?" he asked, leaving the decision entirely to me. I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the years of being treated like a resource, the constant pressure, the gut-wrenching betrayal. Forgiveness felt like a distant shore I wasn't ready to swim to. But I also knew that holding onto the anger forever would only poison my own peace. I decided to write back. My letter was just as short. I wrote, "Mom, thank you for your letter. I acknowledge that you believe your actions came from a place of love. However, the damage caused by those actions was significant. A true reconciliation would require you and Isla to take full responsibility for the lies and the deliberate attempt to manipulate me. It would require honesty and a commitment to change. Until you are both ready for that, a relationship between us is not possible. I wish you well." I sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox, and as I walked away, I felt a final click of release. I had laid down my terms. I had rebuilt the boundary wall, this time with a gate. The gate was locked, but I held the key. Whether they ever chose to do the work required to open it was up to them. My happiness was no longer contingent on their approval or their presence. My life is full and beautiful now. Liam and I are talking about starting a family of our own soon, and I often find myself looking at my office, picturing it as a nursery. But this time, the vision is mine. It is a choice born of love and partnership, not an expectation forced upon me. I built my house with a strong foundation, and after the storm, I learned that the most important structures we build are not made of wood and stone, but of respect, honesty, and the courage to protect them at all costs.